Kids, don't try this at home. We're what you call experts. One day, I was looking at Gagarin prison and I went like, what win cons does Gagarin prison have other than hard-hitting news into a boom? I was looking through the Wayland card list and suddenly I realized that in the wake of Core 2.0, Punitive Counter-Strike remained. It's not rotating. And this is where this deck was born. So we are gonna play Gagarin Asset Spam. Don't worry, it's not the worst. I know that's not saying much. It's a 49 card deck without Museum of History. So yes, my deck will actually be finite and this game will actually end sometime. I'm up against Smoke. A run-based Smoke, so that's probably good. It means that my opponent won't really have the economy to contest my assets, and they probably won't have the breakers to contest my tour guides unless they're running Switchblade. So we'll see about that. Now, the first thing to do as the Gagarin Punitive is to set up your economy. To win with Punitive Counter-Strike, you need to be able to outmoney your opponent, land 2 Punitive Counter-Strikes, and that's pretty expensive, so you want to get the money rolling with Commercial Bankers Group. Unfortunately, my opponent is proactive in checking my remotes here and there. They find my CBG and trash it, so I won't be getting that big of money, which is a big problem because I do have a diversified portfolio in hand. Meanwhile, I do get total back triggers and illegal arms factory triggers as well, so I'm getting quite a few cards, not too bad. And I overdraw here, not too worried about agendas because I can protect HQ with a tour guide, which I do right now. You also see that there's Wampo Reclamation in my hand. Wampo is an amazing card in Asset Spam, and I'll be using it once I find that there are too many agendas in my hand. But for now, I want to actually keep agendas in hand. Firstly, this is bait for landing a Punitive. This allows me to, threaten the Punitive Counter-Strike. But more importantly, I also do not want to stack R&D with too many agendas, because otherwise my opponent can go in for an indexing or something, deep data mining, get all those agendas. That's not good for me. My opponent has been playing Peace in our time, which is quite interesting. That's actually a very bad card for me, because Punitive Counter-Strike can be pretty expensive to land. So double Punitive is actually really expensive. You might need as much as twice your opponent's credit level in order to land 2 successive Punitive Counter-Strikes, which is why I feel that Punitive by itself might not be a sufficient win condition. So there's something else spicy in my deck that you'll see soon enough. But first, I continued focusing on making money, and now I have 2 illegal arms factories ticking down, doing a lot of good work for me. Asset Spam is all about the card draw, which is why Estelle Moon HB is one of the strongest archetypes back before Rotation and Core 2.0 hit. Now that Estelle Moon has been taken down a notch because HB is not that powerful, we look to Wayland for Illegal Arms Factory, which is pretty strong. Now, the bad part is a big downside, which is why I run a lot of Elizabeth Mills. That being said, it's still very expensive for my opponent to trash. I know that they were not going to be interested in it, being 7 to trash each. That's nasty. Even the bad part doesn't really make it worth it. So here, I'm going to start using the Wampo Reclamation because I found 2 agendas in my hand. Gotta be careful about my opponent running HQ just in case, so I'm going to Wampo that away. And one amazing thing about Wampo, for those of you who have not played with this card before, is that you actually get 2 triggers for off it. You get 1 trigger on your turn and 1 trigger on your opponent's turn. They can't really do anything to react before that. So you can potentially bury up to 2 agendas with Wampo Reclamation, even if they aggressively trash it like my opponent does here. I chose not to bury the high-risk investment that you see in my hand now, because I actually want to be able to score it. I have a graph going behind the 3rd server from the left, and once I score that graph, I assume my opponent can't get through it because it's a tour guide blocking it with Sandberg on the 4th server from the left to boot. So once I score the graph, I want to be prepared to score my high-risk investment soon after. So I want at least 1 agenda in my HQ. Here, I use the 2 stack tech startups I've left on the table to tutor up 2 bioethics associations. So this is basically the other half of my win con. Double Punitive is a bit hard to land, especially with my opponent on 17 credits and with a Tapworm installed. To fix that, I have bioethics. So the idea is, if they don't run the bioethics, if they instead go contest this agenda that I've advanced right here, What's going to happen is that my opponent will lose cards from their hand to bioethics. That will put them below the 3 card threshold they need to survive a single punitive, and I can then punitive them away, making the kill easier. So it's basically like the old IG49, where you try to have a critical mass of bioethics on table and then flip them all at one shot at the start of your turn to inflict enough damage and then finish them off with an advanced Ronin. Same thing here, except you substitute the advanced Ronin for a punitive counter-strike. Now my opponent does go for the advanced agenda here, as you would expect, and I'm going to res the tour guide here. They can't Divey. 2 credits. Stealth credits. Break all subroutines. Well, blimey. I thought I would be good given my opponent didn't run Switchblade, but Divey is just as good. Sure, getting it up to 6 strength is a bit of a pain, but 2 credits to break all the subroutines on tour guide and stealing my 3-pointer. And to top it all off, a legwork that could potentially close out the game. I have 2 3-pointers in my hand. If my opponent snags them both, it's game. Here I res the tour guide because it just drains all their money. So actually, if I survive this legwork, I would actually win. They hit the second card, it's a graph, but the third card misses, so I flip the double bioethics. That brings them down to 2 cards in their hand, and a single punitive counter-strike finishes them off. Rule number 1 against New Age Wayland: don't steal 6 agenda points in a single turn. No one enjoys Gagarin, especially not when they win, myself included. So let's spend the rest of this time talking about what you can do, not to play Gagarin, but to play against it. Sometimes playing the decks you hate the most is a good and enlightening way of finding out what you need to do to beat said decks. It is pretty oppressive, but when you look at Gagarin, it doesn't really have that many possible win conditions. While Wayland has some very powerful cards in Economy, Ice, and Draw, they lack the win con that the other factions do have. So that is one fairly important weakness. Some of the more popular win conditions for the co-op include Punitive Counter-Strike, which I successfully used this game, as well as the typical hard-hitting news into Zealous Judge combo. This is a rather fatal combo because as the runner, you typically don't have enough clicks to get rid of the 4 tags from hard-hitting news and to contest the Zealous Judge server at the same time. So the 2 things that these 2 have in common is that they are both traces initiated by the co-op that cannot be initiated until the runner actually makes a run. Therefore, the big moral of the story here is to be richer than the co-op. Only run when you have the credit lead over the co-op. This is easily achievable if you're running Tapworm, which is a very cute card for attaining credit parity, because you are you're exploiting Gagarin's big credit level to your own advantage. It's really neat that way. And of course, Magnum Opus, as I mentioned in the Ayla video, Magnum Opus is such a good economy card. Why wouldn't you run it? Well, if you're not running either of those, well, it's still important to trash Commercial Bankers Group. That card, it gives an insane amount of economy, even though it looks like you can never beat Gagarin's economy if you're not running either of these 2 cards. It's still fairly important to trash CBG. Don't leave it there just because it looks futile to trash assets. You'll be surprised how quickly CBG can allow other win conditions like Sandberg get out of hand. You do not want to leave them out in the open. Now, what about asset spam? Frankly, with Wizard gone, it's much harder to combat spam, I'll give you that. However, it's not all gone. In fact, every single faction, runner faction, has a way of countering asset spam. The most popular faction, Shaper, has probably one of the best asset spam counter cards in the form of Astrolabe. It's a very powerful console that essentially allows you to draw your entire deck when you're up against asset spam. There's no reason not to play it in Shaper. If you are being greedy and you are trying to play something like the Gauntlet instead of Astrolabe in your Shaper deck, well, don't come to me complaining when you lose to Gagarin. As for criminals, Aeneas Informant is still a poor man's scrubber. It's not as good, but it can do some work, and because criminals typically want to spend a restricted slot on Employee Strike, it seems like a pretty good combo if you can get E-Strike going to neuter Gagarin's ID and then farm up for Aeneas money. You could be in a very good place to trash the entire board. Anarchs, as usual, are the best at dismantling core board state, and they have quite a few means to do so. Hacktivist Meeting is a very obvious hard counter. Scrubber, a poor man's wizard. And Mining Accident, not to be underestimated. Valencia also falls in this category. Bad publicity is really bad for Gagarin, and if you can get some mining accidents going early, Gagarin can really struggle to recover because they need a critical mass of like turtlebags and illegal arms factories to get going. If they are forced to spend their early turns mitigating the mining accident bad publicity with their Elizabeth Mills, this will buy you a lot of time to assault the centrals and win. And hey, when I said each runner faction has a way to counter it, I haven't even touched on the mini factions yet. Apex has Apocalypse, and that is always a very powerful card. As long as you're not against hostile infrastructure, Apocalypse will do the trick, especially if you are struggling with getting through that crazy good ice. Well, you only need to get through each piece of ice once before blowing everything to bits with Apocalypse. Just watch out for the Christian Brits. Finally, if you don't pack any of these counter cards as well, there's always counterplay available. And I think this is one thing that a lot of players, especially the not so good players, I have to say, tend to forget. A lot of players, from my observation, tend to focus too much on including hate cards and the deck building aspect. They completely forget that Netrunner at the end of the day is still a game where you have to outplay your opponent. There's always counterplay at every turn and corner, and one thing you can do against asset spam is to ignore the assets entirely. This sounds crazy, but in this day and age, without Jackson Howard, where asset spam is nerfed in the sense that friends in high places is no longer available, and you can't play both Mamba Temple and Museum of History in the same deck due to the restricted list, assaulting centrals only becomes a lot more viable a strategy. So keep that in mind. If you're trying to assault centrals only and you're letting the assets go, Tour Guide is going to be your biggest nightmare. This is the one thing you need to have a solution for if your plan is to ignore Gagarin's asset spam. Tour Guide easily gets out of hand if you don't control the assets. My opponent Smoke managed to snipe a couple of my assets here and there, but they were no match for my Tour Guide. That is, of course, unless they packed one of these interesting cards. Divey, absolutely amazing. Switchblade as well. For 2 stealth credits with these stealth breakers, you can get past Tour Guide easily. Shrike M2. 1 stealth credit for Switchblade, 2 stealth credits for Divey. Anyway, Shrike is a very reliable breaker. It'll cost 2 influence for most factions, but if you really need to pack something for Tour Guide, this is your go-to breaker. It's awfully expensive, whether for breaking Tour Guide or any other sentry, but you don't have that many good options if you're not on stealth, unless of course you go Security Nexus. Bypassing Tour Guides is the best feeling in the world, and it is especially strong against Gagarin, because Gagarin tends to run very few ice, therefore they can't really stack ice against you. As such, the limitation of once per turn on Nexus suddenly becomes a lot less relevant. What about their insane draw and filtering? We used to think that NBN was one of the best factions for draw because they had Sensi Actors Union and DBS, but with Sensi Actors Union out of the way, and with Friends out of the way, making Estelle Moon a bit less good, suddenly Illegal Arms Factory becomes the most illegal, criminal, crazy card draw engine there. 1 credit and a card per turn, nothing to scoff at. One very important counterplay to this is to save up for a power turn. You want to abuse and exploit Illegal Arms Factory's downside against itself. And you do that by saving up for a power turn where you spend your first click trashing an Illegal Arms Factory, gaining a bad publicity which you can then utilize to systematically trash the other important assets from Gagarin's board before they can find themselves an Elizabeth Mills. Of course, this is redundant if they have an unrest Elizabeth Mills on board already, but if it's early on in the game, like I was, during the entire game, I did not have a Mills available. My opponent trashed the 1 Mills from my hand. It had my opponent actually spend the money to trash both my Illegal Arms Factories that were installed, I think they would have a pretty good time dismantling my entire board. So this is a big weakness that you can capitalize on against Gagarin. Wampoa Reclamation is another powerful card which performs the burying ability that Sensi Actors Union and DBS allows you to. As I mentioned in the video, it's very powerful because Gagarin decks tend to run very few agendas, single digits, and as soon as they find a Wampoa Reclamation, whether through tech startup boot camp or by simply drawing into it, they can easily mitigate flood by dumping 2 agendas to the bottom of the deck immediately. Once on their turn, once on your turn. So unfortunately, there's not much you can do against that. As such, it is a must kill against non-museum decks. Because once the agendas hit the bottom of the deck, there's very little you can do to retrieve it unless you're running Showing Off. Against Museum of History decks, however, this is a completely different story, because Museum of History forces an R&D shuffle. This means that the agendas are no longer tucked at the bottom of R&D. They are now evenly spread out across the deck in theory, and therefore running R&D becomes less unviable. This is an important point to note. So it might not be as high a priority target as in non-museum decks. Of course, needless to say, Wampo is a must trash regardless if you are going in all in on HQ pressure. If you are relying on HQ interfaces or legworks, Wampo reclamation on the board means that you will never steal any agendas from HQ. Important point to note. Now we move on to some win cons. Sandberg, as always, is a pain and is so good in Gagarin because you are very unlikely to check assets already. You never know when the Sandberg is on the table. As such, even though I've listed a bunch of counter cards here, by far the best counter to Sandberg is actually being aware of its threat and not running into nasty ice until you have done the Sandberg mats, which is easy to do. You know how much money the corp has. Make sure you have enough money to break the high strength ice boosted with Sandberg before you even bother running. This is quite important because if you are forced to take the face check penalty on ice, you might be in trouble. And secondly, once you make the run, you open yourself to a lot of nasty effects like hard hitting news, and that's where you lose. So don't run unless you know you can deal with the Sandberg tax. Also worth mentioning that Sandberg is usually not that punishing even in my deck. I usually rely on Tour Guides and Hives as my best ice, and they both only just keep the runner out. They don't trash programs or do anything nasty to the runner. So not that much synergy as say with Grail Ice or something like an Archer. As for counter cards, if you have Political Operative, you can kill the Sandberg during a run. David allows you to get past these high strength ice once, always good to have. Femme Fatale, bypass, always good to have as well. And of course, speaking of bypass, Security Nexus is here to save you again. What about hard hitting news and Zealous Judge? This is a more difficult combo to deal with. One counter I didn't point out was having extra clicks. So if you have Beth, for example, Beth Killing Chang is a very good counter. Gives you 5 clicks, 4 clicks to clear tags, and 1 click to run on the Zealous Judge. Something to keep note of. Otherwise, you have Misdirection in the Shaper faction. This is probably the best anti-hard hitting news card you can get. On the Lamb and Paper Tripping is the next best in Criminal faction. Tag Avoidance, tag Removal, all at once. Very good stuff. Political Operative, a very underrated card. Again, pulls double duty. Not only kills Sandberg, but also kills Zealous Judge as soon as the court reses it. Nope, you're not having it. You can afford to clear 4 tags after the hard hitting news turn and not worry about Zealous Judge if you have Apollo installed. Finally, if you go tag me, if you are playing counter surveillance, well, you love those hard hitting news and Zealous Judges, don't you? That's fine as well. Next, Punitive Counter-Strike. This one, well, it never really was a powerful card, and with good reason. Ever since Film Critic came out, it has just been too difficult to land a good Punitive Counter-Strike, not to mention that runners were rich. Filthy rich. Temujin makes it impossible to outtrace the corp. Not till now. So in a world where runners are now poor, what can you do against Punitive Counter-Strike? As I mentioned, Film Critic is always a possibility, but you are expanding that restricted slot, and it is easily countered in faction by Wayland. All they need to do is to slot 1 Contract Killer, and as soon as you drop your Film Critic, it gets killed by Contract Killer. So if you are running Film Critic as your primary means of counter against Punitive Counter-Strike, you need to keep in mind that Contract Killers will hose you. You ideally want to drop Film Critic only on a big turn where you're running, when you're doing your deep data mining or legworks or whatever. One fun way to deal with Punitive Counter-Strike is to use Mad Dash of Freedom through Equality. The main modes of kill with Punitive are either with a Government Takeover for 6 points and 6 meat damage, or for a 3-pointer that does 3 meat damage. Usually, if they are going for the 3-pointer route, the corp will have 2 chances to get you with the meat damage. Once when you steal the first 3-pointer, and another time when you steal the second 3-pointer. Well, they won't have the second chance if you steal either of those agendas with a +1 agenda point mode such as Mad Dash of Freedom 3 quality. Giving the opponent one less chance to kill you is like giving them one less Hunter Seeker or one less mid-seasons. All these are very important and add up very quickly. So, yeah, that's very important to note. We'll get back to that in a bit. Another good counter to Punitive is the same thing as what you do against Scorch or Boom. You simply play Sports Hopper. Double points if you play in Geist. Geist is unkillable, and Punitive Counter-Strike is no exception to that. As Geist, especially with the Link, you don't really have to worry about Punitive as a win con. Finally, a very unorthodox way of bypassing Punitive is to increase your max hand size. Not many good decks out there that have this have plus max hand size cards in the deck, but it's an option. So those are hate cards, but once again, nothing beats good counterplay. And oftentimes, actually, the best way to circumvent Punitive Counter-Strike is to hit them when they are the weakest. And from this game, it was quite clear that in the early game I was struggling. I had that Graft in my opening hand, if you remember. And my opponent could have easily ran HQ a bunch of times to steal it, and I wouldn't have the money to follow up with a Punitive Counter-Strike. The opening turns are very horrible for Gagarin, and they often have to do really sneaky measures such as installing the Graft naked on the table, as I did, just to avoid my opponent stealing it. You notice that immediately after I installed the Graft that game, my opponent started running my hand, got the Elizabeth Mills, but did not find the Graft because it was already on the table. This is what you have to do as Corp to make ends meet, and as a runner you can abuse that. If you play aggressive early, run early, and steal a 3-pointer early on, you basically become immune to Punitive Counter-Strike, especially if you have Mad Dash of Freedom 3 quality in your deck. You can just sit back and wait for the 3-pointer to appear, and then Mad Dash it for the win. That's how you win against Punitive. No need for hate cards, no need Film Critic, no need to, worry about me damage protection. Just play well, identify their weaknesses, and stab them before they get a chance to grow too powerful. Hopefully, this has enlightened you to playing against Gagarin, even though it's a nasty matchup and most decks probably don't have a good win rate against it. You can increase your win rate by keeping these counter cards in mind, and more importantly, making these counter plays during the gameplay itself. Trust me, that's how you become a better player, using a combination of the two to your advantage. Thanks for watching, and happy net running. Goodbye.